All the Young Dudes, Sirius's Perspective by Rollercosterwords. Chapter 133, 7th year, Sunday afternoon. Monday the 29th of January, 1978. Mooney? It's after midday.
So?
Thought you might fancy getting up?
No thanks.
Can I come in?
Nope.
It had been like this since Wednesday. Sirius had arrived at the Care of Magical Creatures classroom only to discover that Remus was already gone, along with Mary and Marlene. He'd found Lily and James, who explained in hushed voices what had happened. Marlene's brother was one of the victims. He was still alive and in St. Mungo's. Nobody seemed to know much more than that. All Lily had heard was that it didn't look good. Of course, it didn't take much imagination to figure out what that meant. When Sirius returned to the dorm afterwards, the curtains had already been drawn around Remus's bed. Now, Sirius stared at those same velvety bed curtains, stomach sinking. Remus had hardly left his bed since Wednesday, only getting up to use the bathroom. He bunked off all his classes on Thursday and Friday. Somehow no one had given him detention for it, which Sirius suspected had something to do with Madame Pomfrey. He hadn't even gotten up for meals. If the marauders hadn't been smuggling food up to him and passing it through a crack in the curtains, Sirius reckoned he might have starved to death by now. "Okay then," Sirius said quietly, turning to leave. He'd try again later. Maybe sneak over to Honeydukes and nick some chocolate frogs. Chocolate always seemed to make Mooney feel better.
"I'm sorry."
He was halted by Remus's voice, weak and somewhat scratchy, but still loud enough to be heard through the curtains.
"I do want you here. I just don't know what to say."
Sirius hesitated, wishing that he knew what to say, wishing that he could find the magic words that would make everything better, would make Remus stop punishing himself for something that hadn't even been his fault to begin with. "We don't have to talk." There was a pause.
"Okay then."
Sirius pulled back the curtains immediately, making Remus wince as the sunlight streamed in. He clambered onto the bed and let the curtains drop shut behind him, trying not to stare. Despite lying in bed for the past 4 days, Remus looked as though he'd hardly slept. His face was drawn, eyes shadowed by deep bags. His hair was a mess, curls sticky with frizz, flattened in some places and sticking up in others, and he was still wearing the same pyjamas he'd had on since Wednesday. Sirius reached out, pulling him into his arms. "Thanks," he muttered softly, "for letting me in."
"Reckon I must stink."
Sirius buried his face in Remus's hair, inhaling deeply as the other boy tried to squirm away. "Nope, just smell like Mooney."
"Go off, mutt."
Remus shoved him off, smiling. "Feel like getting up soon. Everyone's worried, and now they're looking at me, like I know what to do, because everybody knows about us, which is weird, and quite a lot of pressure, really." Remus actually laughed at that, and Sirius felt himself smiling, but after a moment the other boy looked down.
"I still don't feel like getting up."
"Okay, then you need to let me hide here with you, because I'm not going back out there alone."
"Sirius."
"Remus." Sirius pulled a face, knotting his eyebrows together.
"Stop it," Remus huffed, crossing his arms like a child throwing a temper tantrum.
"I will not," Sirius nudged him. "Come on, I know you're feeling like shit about everything, but did you ever consider that it's not for you to hog all of the misery like this? That maybe if you talk to your friends it might not all seem quite so bleak?"
Remus frowned skeptically. "Maybe that works for you."
"Are you saying this isn't working for you?"
Remus narrowed his eyes, lips pressing into a thin line.
Sirius stared right back, refusing to back down, and after a moment Remus looked as if he might say something. Then he paused, sniffing.
"Are you bleeding? I can smell blood."
"Uh-oh." "Probably from you. From the moon."
"No, I've already healed. I never have open wounds longer than a day."
"Bloody hell," Sirius shook his head, grinning. "How is it possible for you to get any cooler?"
"And it's your blood. I can tell."
"There you go again. You're basically a superhero."
"Sirius."
Okay, he sighed, tugging his fingers through his hair. "You swiped at me a few times over the moon. I told you that. We did it to each other. And you can't turn me when I'm a dog. We've tested that enough times."
"Are you still bleeding? That was almost a week ago. You need to go to Madame Pomfrey."
"Oh yeah, and say that my werewolf boyfriend scratched me while I was in dog form as an illegal animagus."
"Jesus,"
Remus huffed, clambering to his feet. He snagged Sirius's wrist, tugging him along. "Where are we going?"
I need better light.
He dragged Sirius over to the bathroom, shoving him inside and slamming down the toilet lid.
Sit.
Sirius obeyed, trying to suppress the smug smile that wanted to creep across his face. Who knew that all it took was a little blood to get Remus out of bed? The taller boy threw open the mirrored cabinet above the sink, digging around and muttering to himself. Sirius was pretty sure that he caught the words reckless, impossible, and idiot in precisely that order. After a moment, Remus turned to him, holding a jar of Murtlap essence, a bottle of one of his muggle medicines, fresh gauze, and cotton balls. He shifted most of it into one arm, pulling out his wand with his free hand.
Okay, show me.
Sirius hesitated, knowing that the injury would most likely just add to Remus's guilt. But there wasn't anything he could do now. Moony had him cornered. It's not that bad. He lifted his shirt, watching Remus's face closely as he revealed the 3 red stripes that already began to scab over on his ribs. Sirius watched the other boy's eyes go flat, the mark of some internal reaction that he could only begin to guess at, likely beating himself up again. After a long moment, Remus met his eye. He took a breath and reached for his wand. The healing lessons with Madame Pomfrey must have been going well. In a matter of minutes, the redness was gone, skin almost completely healed over into 3 white stripes.
I'm so sorry, Remus said, staring at them. It was a magical wound. You'll have a scar there for the rest of your life now.
Sirius looked down at the 3 lines, studying them. They were different from his other scars. Not the straight, precise slash of his mother's cruelty, but more jagged, rough around the edges, the mark of the wolf. He looked back up, 2 dark eyes flecked with gold.
That's fine, Remus, he said softly.
Having managed to coax Remus out from bed, Sirius was finally able to convince him to rejoin society. He waited while the other boys showered, then accompanied him downstairs to the common room where their friends were waiting. Nobody commented on Remus's prolonged absence, only smiled and shifted over to make room for him in their little circle of chairs and couches near the fireplace. It had been a stressful few days for everyone, and they all knew better than to bring up anything that had to do with the recent attacks. Following the initial article, the Prophet had printed a list of the dead, with a small black and white photograph next to each name. On the next page, they'd included a list of those presumed bitten, also followed by photographs, which caused quite a stir. Liberal commentators insist that it was a violation of privacy, while those on the more conservative end pointed out that new werewolves. Liberal commentators insisted that it was a violation of privacy, while those on the more conservative end of the spectrum pointed out that new werewolves would have had to add their names to the registry anyway, which is public information. This only reignited the debate about whether the registry was a violation of privacy to begin with, though those arguing against it were far more outnumbered than those who insisted it was for everybody's safety. In the end, the original argument about whether the name should have been broadcasted was completely lost to a political finger-pointing and accusations of radicalism from both ends of the spectrum. There was no new information on any of the perpetrators of the attack. Marlene had disappeared on Wednesday, and nobody had heard anything since from her, not even Mary. Her brother was given his own special feature, 4 inches of text, thanks to his celebrity status as a beater for the Chudley Cannons. The Prophet had interviewed the team's manager, who told them that although it was not fully aware of the details on Danny's condition, the Cannons maintained a zero-tolerance policy to half-breeds and dangerous creatures, and were currently looking into the allegations of infection. James tore down every single one of his Chudley Cannons posters and burned them in the fireplace, vowing to never see another game. After 4 days of hearing nothing but news and debates about werewolves, the entire group deliberately steered clear of the topic as they made their way down to Sunday lunch. Lily complained about something Isadora Finch had said in Slug Club, James outlined his newest idea for a Quidditch strategy, and Mary rattled on about some article she'd found in Witch Weekly, which sorted your personality type based on season. Back in the common room, they settled down once more in front of the fireplace. Lily and James curled up in an armchair together, discussing something that had to do with prefect patrols. Sirius took one of the personality quizzes in Mary's magazine. She had darted off to see some Ravenclaw boy. And Remus sat on the carpet across from Peter, losing at chess. "You know what we ought to start getting serious about," Sirius said, sorting through his record collection, now that Witch Weekly had determined him a summer. "Newts?" Remus asked, as Peter moved to check his king. "Job applications?" Lily suggested. She was now taking the same personality quiz, still curled up on James's lap. "The Quidditch Cup?" her boyfriend asked, sitting up a bit straighter. "Oh, for goodness sake," Sirius shook his head. "I'm ashamed to call you all marauders." "What?" the three of them yelped, affronted. Peter grinned. "He's talking about the big prank on Slytherin. You know, the one we started planning before Christmas." "Wormy boy, you are without a doubt my very favourite person." Sirius blew him a kiss, and Peter rolled his eyes. "Bugger off." His bishop captured Remus's queen. "Ugh, I don't know why I bother. I haven't beaten you since I was 13, Remus groaned, settling back onto his elbows as he sprawled across the rug. "Well then," he raised an eyebrow at Sirius. "Got a plan?" "Maybe. Whatever we do, I think we should focus the attack on the dungeons." "Let's not throw around words like attack," Lily interjected quickly. "It's just a practical joke, right? In the wholesome spirit of harmless health rivalry." "If you like," Sirius said neutrally. "Anyway, Moony, I thought your study group was in on this. What's the point of having all these minions if you can't make them work for you?" "Oh my god, for the last time, they're not my minions." Remus pulled a face. "Anyway, I've not had a proper study group yet this term. I've been ever so slightly busy." "Well, as none of us are scheduled to be in mortal peril for the next month or so," Sirius said lightly, "I think we ought to get cracking. Everyone could do with a laugh, eh? Assemble the troops. We'll meet sometime next week." "As long as it doesn't clash with Quidditch." James paused, yawning. "I'm right there. Right, I'm off to bed. Transfiguration first thing." The yawn, highly contagious, made its way round the circle, and everyone began to glance at the clock. It was getting late, and everyone else was going up to bed anyway, so they stood and waited for James to say goodnight to Lily, which seemed to become a lengthier and more involved process every day, before trekking upstairs to the dorm. Sirius was waiting outside the bathroom when Remus walked out, already in his pyjamas, and headed for the door, muttering, "Getting my book." He grinned and shook his head fondly as Moony disappeared down the stairs, taking his turn to brush his teeth. When he'd finished getting ready for bed, he lay on his stomach, watching James catch and release his golden snitch. "Worried about Moony?" he asked after a moment. A bit," James nodded. "But he seems better, doesn't he? Actually, I was thinking about Marlene." "Ah." Sirius nodded. He'd never been particularly close with Marlene himself. They'd only ever hung out in groups, where she tended to be a bit quieter than the other loud-mouthed friends. But he'd always been rather fond of the girl, aside from her irritating tendency to moralise at all times at the wrong moments. Apart from her irritating tendency to moralise at all the wrong moments. With her dry sense of humour and no-nonsense attitude. And he knew that she and James had bonded quite a bit over Quidditch, since he'd become the captain. If Sirius was honest with himself, he was actually a little jealous about it. He still sometimes missed the days when he and James had been Quidditch teammates, cracking jokes together at practice and taunting each other in the locker room. "I mean, Remus has got you," James continued, still fidgeting with the snitch. "And of course Marlene's got all of us, but sometimes it helps, I think, to have someone, especially during times like this." Sirius swallowed, thinking of Yasmin. James didn't know then. He supposed Marlene had always been sort of private. She was like Remus in that way. "Well," he said slowly, "she's still got all of her friends, like you said. I'm sure she'll be all right." "Yeah," James sighed. "It's just such bullshit. I keep thinking about Danny, too. I can't believe the Cannons would do that to him. I've always looked up to them, you know. Always thought they were so cool. Sometimes I feel like the whole world's going backwards, and then I wonder if things are really changing, or if they've always been like this and I just never noticed. And I don't know which one would be worse." "Yeah," Sirius breathed, wishing he knew what to say. He hardly ever heard James talk like this. Prongs was supposed to be the best of them, endlessly optimistic, the person reassuring everybody else that it would all be okay. Sirius didn't know what to do if the roles were reversed. James must have caught sight of his expression, because he perked up and shot him a grin. "Anyway, don't mind me," he said, tucking the snitch away into his bedside table. "I'm knackered. Just talking nonsense, really." Sirius opened his mouth to reply, but James was faster, asking, "Oi, where did Moony go?" Sirius frowned, glancing at the clock. It had been 15 minutes. Hadn't Remus just been going to fetch his book? "Dunno. I'll check. Halfway down the stairs, Sirius paused, sniffing the air. Ah, well, that explained where Remus had gone. Moony! Where are you? He called out, grinning as he burst into the common room. I can smell the pot all the way from here. You're not being subtle. Oh, hiya, MacDonald. Black? Mary grinned. She was perched on the arm of Remus's chair, wearing a very short dress that rode up her thighs as she shifted. Sorry, I'm not trying to seduce your boyfriend. Sirius snorted. Oh yeah, I'd like to see you try. Wait, my what? She only smirked in response, giving him a knowing look. He turned to Remus. Are we just telling everyone now? Oi! Mary protested, standing up. I'm not everyone, arrogant tosser, and don't forget I had you both first. Sirius gaped, at an utter loss of how to respond, and Remus laughed at him. Sorry, I'll come up now. We were just chatting. He glanced over at Mary. Will you be okay? Fine. She headed towards the girls' dorms. I'm off to bed too. Night, lads. Good night. They were greeted by the muffled sounds of Peter snoring upon their return to the room, along with a cheery smile from James, who was studying his Quidditch notebook. Thought we'd lost you, Moony, he said quietly, glancing up at them. I bumped into Mary. She's been at some party with the Ravenclaws. See, this is what happens when you get stuck with the head boy and head girl in your house, Sirius complained, moving over to his bed. All the fun happens elsewhere. Oh, stop your whining, James tutted, smiling fondly as he shut his notebook. We'll have more parties and you know it. Now go to bed like a good boy. Fine. Sirius flopped back dramatically onto his pillows, yawning. Good night then, Remus whispered, beginning to walk over towards his own bed. Sirius reached out quickly, grabbing his wrist. Moony, he muttered, staring up at him from behind the bed curtains. On the underside of his wrist, Sirius ran his thumb in small circles. Remus glanced towards James, then back, biting his lip. Okay, he acquiesced, and Sirius grinned devilishly as he pulled him inside. All the Young Dudes. Sirius's Perspective by Rollercosterwords. Chapter 134. 7th year, Valentine's Day, 1978. Tuesday the 14th of February, 1978. James. 6:30 a.m. Psst! Oi, Padfoot! James stood outside Sirius's bed curtains, whispering. Normally, he might just tear the velvet hangings back so that he could shake the boy awake, but of course that was no longer an option. Yeah, I'm up, Sirius whispered, poking her head out. He rubbed at his eyes and yawned, curtains parting as he stood. James caught a brief glimpse of sandy curls spread across the pillow, but he glanced away quickly. It wasn't that he minded, exactly. Of course not. By now he was used to Remus and Sirius sharing a bed, and quite aware that they probably did other things as well. And that was fine. It was all perfectly fine. James supported them 100%. It had been a bit of a shock, though, at first. Remus had just sort of made sense, but Sirius? More than anything else, James was upset that he hadn't noticed, that he'd been so oblivious for so long. It had just never occurred to him that something in the realm of possibility, that Sirius Black might be, well, whatever he was, and to find out that they were together, had been together for months. Well, it took a bit of getting used to. But this morning, of course, James had other things to worry about. He couldn't stop himself from fretting as they snuck down to the great hall, leaving Peter and Remus to sleep in their dorm. Think there's going to be enough room? James glanced around the empty hall anxiously. Don't want anyone getting hurt. They're floral fireworks. Sirius rolled his eyes. No one's getting hurt unless they've got severe allergies. Bugger, I hadn't thought about allergies. Sirius gave him a look. Merlin, don't tell me you're going to change your mind now. Not after you dragged me down here at this ungodly hour. I'm not, okay? Come on, let's do it then. He didn't mean to fret. He knew how hard Sirius had worked to help him, knew that they'd gotten everything right, knew that it should all go off without a hitch, but he just needed to make sure that it was perfect. He was James Potter, after all. It was what everyone expected of him. Sometimes it made James feel like a fraud, the confidence that had come so naturally when he was younger, when the world felt like one big adventure, just waiting to be conquered, and he thought himself the storybook hero. He'd enjoyed having people look at him, praise him, admire him. After all, he'd earned it, hadn't he? But the problem with climbing onto people's pedestals, James had realised as he grew older, was that once you were up so high, there was no way to jump down that didn't end with someone getting hurt. As the world got darker and the bad guys got scarier and people grew more afraid, as James watched his friends suffer and found himself helpless to stop it, he began to wonder, sometimes, if he had only set himself up for failure, if it was inevitable that one day he would let everyone down. But for today, at least, he could make sure that things were perfect. James double-checked the detonators that Sirius had set, ensuring that all the trigger charms were perfectly calibrated. "What are you going to do for the rest of the day?" Sirius asked, perched on the table and watching James obsessively check over their work. "Or do you reckon that cat's enough?" It was actually a kitten, not a cat. A grey little thing that James had fetched from Hagrid's hut that morning, sneaking down at 6 a.m. to do so, but he didn't bother correcting Sirius. "She's got most of the day free, and I've arranged for the prefect's bathroom to be mysteriously closed for repairs," he replied, smiling smugly. "How romantic," Sirius smirked. "It is, actually. Or at least, it would be once he lit all the candles he'd scattered around the tub, and cast the new olfactory charm he'd learnt on the fluffy towels so that they smelled like roses. But he wasn't about to tell his friends about any of that. Sirius would have a field day. Instead, he changed the subject. "What about you? Still steering clear of Mooney?" "Eh? The fight, last night." They hadn't exactly been subtle about their bickering, sniping at each other over some Valentine's Day nonsense. For two people that had been best mates for nearly 7 years, they could be remarkably hopeless at communicating. "It wasn't a fight," Sirius huffed. "We made up, anyway. Just did a silencing spell so you'd stop eavesdropping." "Oh, is that what that's for?" James couldn't resist teasing, just a bit. It was still new to him, that part of his mates' relationships. But he was determined to not treat them any differently, at least once he'd gotten over the initial shock. And when Sirius had been with his girlfriends, James had given him endless shit about it. So he figured the best course of action was to just carry on. "Piss off," Sirius shoved at him as he hopped off the table. "Mr. Prefect's bathroom." "Godric Black, are you blushing? Are you actually blushing?" James shoved him back, snickering. "Wow, Mooney must be something else." "I can't believe you." Sirius turned towards the door, walking quickly away to hide the spots of red colouring his cheeks. "Oh, come on now." James hurried to catch up with him. "You know, I'm actually relieved. You two act like butter wouldn't melt most of the time. I've never seen you two kiss." He hoped it was the right thing to say. Sirius had been all bluster the first time James stumbled upon him in bed, smirking suggestively and making snarky comments for the rest of the day. But the moment James had gotten over his own awkwardness about the situation and started teasing him back, it was like the tables had turned. Suddenly, Sirius clammed up, acting for all intensive purposes as if he'd never so much as held hands with Remus. It was a marked change from the way he'd been with the girls, when he'd shared every solid detail of his escapades without so much as batting an eye. Sirius slowed down a bit, frowning. "Do you think that's weird?" he asked, chewing on his lip. "That you haven't, seen us? Kissing, I mean." James blinked, trying to think of the right thing to say. "Well, I don't know. You do kiss, don't you?" "Obviously, James." "Well then, I just assumed it was Mooney being his awkward self." "Yeah, it is. But you know, we can't be as public as you and Evans." James fell quiet, considering that. Of course, he knew the sorts of things people said about blokes who fancied other blokes. He'd heard it all too, growing up. But his parents had never really seemed to care one way or the other. and he had always tutted when people said nasty things about it. "Never be hateful, Jamie," his mother had said to him. "It doesn't matter what another person wears, or if you think they talk funny, or if they choose to live their life differently from you. If you carry hate in your heart, then the only person doing something wrong is you." He had never really realised how lucky he was to have parents like he did. Not until coming to Hogwarts, not until meeting Sirius and Remus. But he understood now that not everyone had a Euphemia Potter. He knew from the way he heard other boys talk in the Quidditch locker room, or the back of class, or after too much fire whiskey at a party, that things would be different for his two best friends. Harder. "No," he responded eventually. "That makes sense. Sorry, mate." He hated that it was all he could say. "Not your fault," Sirius replied. James turned to him earnestly. "You should feel comfortable around us, though," he said. "We're your friends." Yeah, I know. I mean, comfortable within reason," he added, falling back into his teasing banter. "I don't know if I'm quite ready to see my best mates doing, well, if you even, whatever it is you... Potter, are you blushing?" 8:15 a.m. They hovered outside the doors of the Great Hall, peeking in to spy on their friends as they ate breakfast. James found his eyes drawn, as they always were, to the redhead sprinkling sugar on her porridge, smiling distractedly at something Mary had said. Merlin, she was beautiful. Every day James waited for the shock of it to wear off, and every day she took his breath away just the same. Sometimes he had to pinch himself, just to make sure he wasn't dreaming. Lily had just picked up her spoon when the first detonator went off with a loud pop. The others quickly followed, setting off the glittering firework display that James and Sirius had spent hours perfecting. Colourful hearts burst over his girlfriend's head, turning into pink and white lilies that fluttered down onto the table. Sirius clapped him on the shoulder, grinning. "Come on, you big sap. Get over there." Their friends were all smiling and laughing, oblivious to the two approaching boys. Lily appeared to be blushing furiously, and James arrived in time to catch the tail end of her sentence as he strolled up behind her. "Happy with a card?" "Oh, shut up, Evans." Mary shook her head, grinning. "It's bloody gorgeous of him." "Cheers, MacDonald." James winked at her from behind Lily's shoulder. His girlfriend startled, spinning around. "You utter idiot!" She leapt to her feet, throwing her arms around his neck and pulling him in for a kiss. James smiled against her lips, delighted. He was worried that she might be embarrassed or think it was too much. They pulled away just as Sirius waved his wand, gathering together all the scattered lilies and transfiguring them into a little box that he'd tucked the kitten into just moments before. It wasn't actually transfiguration, it was a location-swapping spell. If Filch opened the broom cupboard nearest the Great Hall, he would find himself buried under a cascade of pink and white flowers. But that was a problem for later. "What's that?" Lily twisted, arms still wrapped around James's neck. "Open it and see," he urged, sure he was grinning like a loon, yet unable to stop himself. Across the table, Mary and Remus stood and craned their necks to see. Lily removed the lid carefully, and all three of them leaned forwards. Sitting inside was a little grey kitten, curled up for a nap on the red velvet pillow that James had given him. He had a little blue bow tied around its neck, and yawned lazily as his rest was disturbed, blinking up at them with round yellow eyes. "Oh!" Lily plucked the kitten out of the box immediately, cuddling it to her chest. "Really, Potter? You got me a cat? I love him, or her?" "Him," James confirmed. "I know your old family one died last Christmas, and Hagrid told me a litter was born in the village last week, so..." "Oh, he's so sweet," Mary gushed, reaching out to pat the little cat's head. "Oh, for Merlin's sake." Christopher, who was also sitting across the table, began to grumble. "I'm allergic to cats too. Bloody stupid day." He shoved back from the table and stomped off to find the different seat. "Such a shame," Sirius smirked, sliding into the seat that Christopher had just vacated. "Morning, Meanie." "Morning, Padfoot." James sat down next to Lily, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. She leaned her head against his chest, smiling as she stroked the kitten in her hands. Sirius and Mary began to debate over what to name the cat, with Mary suggesting more and more ridiculous names just to rile Sirius up, and Sirius playing along with it for the fun of bickering. As Remus laughed at their antics, James leaned down. "Do you really like it?" he whispered, just to check. Lily twisted her head, smiling up at him. "I love it," she whispered back. "It's perfect." Peter. 12:15 p.m. Peter poked at his lunch, sulking. He was sitting alone in their usual spot at the Gryffindor table, which would have been bad enough regularly, but it was absolutely mortifying on Valentine's Day. Everywhere he turned, he was confronted with the sight of giggling, happy couples, or else other lonely singles eating grimly by themselves. He speared his roast potato with a fork, a bit more violently than was perhaps necessary. He thought about going to hide in the dorm room, once classes were over, just to escape from all the lovebirds flocking the halls. But one look at the map told him that that was a bad idea. Sirius and Remus were alone in there, and Peter knew better than to walk in or on that. Thank you very much. He shuddered, suppressing the memory of the last time he'd made that mistake. He'd checked for Dorcas's name on the map too, just to see. She was in the Ravenclaw dormitories with Emmeline Vance, for some reason, which Peter found odd. He hadn't realised the two of them were friends, but he supposed it was better than seeing her with some other boy. He sipped his pumpkin juice, thinking back on the last conversation they'd had, the one where she'd broken up with him. For good this time. "I signed up to be your girlfriend, Peter, not your bloody therapist." She'd been so cross with him, for no good reason. Couples were supposed to talk about their feelings, but he should have seen it coming. No one ever wanted to listen to him. He'd said as much to Dorcas, mumbling, "Sorry, I know, I'm annoying. I'll try not to bother you anymore when I'm sad." "No, see? That! What you're doing right now, that's what I'm talking about. Now I'm supposed to say that you're not and tell you it's okay to be sad, and then suddenly the conversation is just all about you again. I don't understand why you're yelling at me. I'm not." She'd blown out an angry breath, scowling. "I am not yelling at you, Peter. I am trying to have one conversation about our relationship where your insecurities aren't the only thing centred." "Well, it's a little hard to not feel insecure when my own girlfriend doesn't even like me." "I do! No, fuck, see, you're just doing it again." Peter pushed his plate away, standing up and hauling his school bag over his shoulders as he made his way out of the hall. He supposed he could go to the library, try and get some homework done, but the thought of sitting by himself, attempting to start his Transfiguration essay for McGonagall, was so bloody pathetic that he found himself just wandering the halls aimlessly, as if that was any better. He wondered if he'd end up eating dinner alone too. Mary had said she was busy all evening, and who knew what Remus and Sirius would be up to. And then there was James and Lily. Even if they did join him for dinner, Peter thought he'd probably prefer to eat alone again than to third wheel with them. He snorted, shaking his head, and he'd thought Sirius and James were bad. Ever since Lily Evans had entered the picture, Potter had turned into a walking personification of a toothache, mind-numbingly sweet, and so mushy that Peter felt like gagging whenever he had to watch the two of them together. He sighed, trudging up one of the staircases. Sometimes Peter couldn't help but think wistfully back on the days before Hogwarts, before Lily, before Quidditch, before Sirius, back when it had just been James and Pete, partners in crime, running amok in their parents' backyards. It had made Peter feel big and bright, having the attention of someone like James Potter. It still made him feel that way. Only now he had James's attention less and less. "Oh, hello, Peter." He looked up from his shoes, startled, to realise that he'd nearly bumped into a couple making their way down the hall. His heart sank. It was Desdemona. She was holding hands with a 6-year, some bloke from the Ravenclaw Quidditch team, of course. All the girls just wanted to date the athletes. If you could chuck a ball through a hoop, you could get any bird you wanted. Peter tried not to scowl. "Oh." He glanced away. "Hi, Desi. Didn't see you there." I don't really go by Desi anymore." "Oh, sorry." They stood awkwardly for a moment. Finally, she cleared her throat. Have you met Julian?" No. Nice to meet you." The Quidditch player, Julian, nodded at him. He was a good 4 inches taller than Pete, and much broader along the shoulders. Girls were so shallow. Another awkward pause. Desdemona took a breath. "Right then." She forced an overly cheery smile. "We'll be off. Have a good Valentine's Day, Peter." The couple hurried away, and Peter watched them go. "Yeah," he muttered, scowling. "Happy Valentine's Day." Mary. 4:27 p.m. God, she was knackered. Mary flopped down on her bed, sighing heavily, not bothering to adjust her skirt as it rolled up her thighs. It wasn't like there was anyone around to see, anyway. Lily was off with James, and Marlene was still gone. But Mary was trying not to think about that. The first date had been a complete washout. If she had been honest with herself, that was what she'd expected. She wasn't exactly sure why she'd agreed to spend the afternoon with Elliot Crane in the first place. Well, okay, the free pot had probably had something to do with it. But even the mellow buzz from the spliff they'd shared hadn't been enough to salvage things once he'd pulled out his acoustic guitar. Still, it could have been worse. At least he didn't try to put his hands up her skirt or call her a bitch when she excused herself to leave. At least he'd been polite. Christ, Mary laughed bitterly as she realised what she was thinking. Since when were basic manners the standard for a good date? She rubbed her fingers against her scalp gently. Once she'd enjoyed dates. She'd actually enjoyed the attention, the compliments, the boys falling over each other to catch her eye. It had made her feel powerful in a way, like she wore the right colour lipstick or undid one of the buttons on her top of her blouse. She could turn heads, puppets, dancing on the end of a string. It had made her feel pretty, and after years of comments in primary school about her hair and her skin and her nose, Mary had been hungry for that feeling. She'd gotten high off it. And then she'd heard the things those same boys said about her behind her back. To her face sometimes, too. And she'd started to realise that pretty meant something very different for her than it did for girls like Lily, or Marlene, or Emmeline Vance. In some ways, wizards and muggles were exactly alike. She sighed again, then pushed herself up off the bed, walking over to the mirror to check her lipstick. It was a uniform day, of course, as they had classes, but she'd still thrown on a pair of red studs and tied a bright red ribbon in her hair. Her lipstick matched. Tying the outfit together, she looked good. More than that, she looked bloody gorgeous. She looked like the type of girl who would bring men to their knees. But at the end of the day, they'd stand back up, and they'd still be men. They'd still be purebloods. They'd still be white. It had begun to make Mary wonder, sometimes, exactly who was the puppet, and who was the one pulling the strings. The door to their room burst open. "Mary!" Lily rushed in a haze of lavender and anxiety and copper hair. "Thank God you're here!" She was holding her new kitten, cradled against her chest, and Mary had to stifle the tug of jealousy in her gut. It wasn't that she wasn't happy for Lily, she was. The girl was a saint. Mary firmly believed that she deserved only good things in life. It was just hard sometimes not to wish that someone would look at her the way that James Potter looked at Lily Evans, that someone would care about her enough to set off fireworks or give her a present that was more meaningful than half a spliff and a shitty Beatles cover on an acoustic guitar. "What's got your knickers in a twist?" Mary asked, raising an eyebrow as she turned. Lily stood in the middle of the room, panicked, clutching the kitten. "It's James," she said helplessly. "He just told me the prefect's bathroom is closed." "Okay." "I mean," bright spots of pink appeared on Lily's cheeks. "He told me it's closed." She raised her eyebrows meaningfully. "Oh," Mary blinked, then felt her face split into a wicked grin. "Oh, I see. He has a romantic evening planned then, does he?" Lily bit her lip, nodding. "I think he wants to." She trailed off, and Mary couldn't help but laugh. "Christ, Lily, you can't even say the word. It won't offend my delicate sensibilities, I promise. You know what I mean." "Do I? Let me think. What could Potter possibly want?" "Oh, come on, Mary, don't tease." I'm sorry. She laughed again, holding her hands up in surrender. Lily had begun to chew her lip nervously, stroking a thumb over the little kitten's head. After a moment, Mary moved to her bed, patting the mattress beside her to indicate that Lily should sit down. "So," she said, as the frazzled girl settled next to her, "what's the problem? Do you not want to?" "No," Lily answered quickly, blushing furiously as she realised what she'd just said. No, I want to. I sort of really want to." "Uh-huh," Mary smirked. "So what is it then? Need me to explain how it works?" "Jesus, Mary, no. I understand the mechanics, thank you very much. I can read." "Oh, please tell me you did not get your sex education from a biology textbook." "Autonomy, actually," Lily sniffed. "It's important to understand how things work." "That's literally the least sexiest thing I think I've ever heard anyone say. And you're talking about sex." "Oh, sod off," Lily blushed, staring down at her lap. The kitten had curled up there, napping. After a minute of silence, Mary sighed. "Lily," she said gently, "I can't help you if you don't talk to me." "I know," the other girl mumbled, face still bright red. Another moment passed. Finally, she sighed. I'm nervous about him seeing me." "Seeing you?" "Oh, you know," she gestured to herself helplessly. "Without..." "Ah," Mary frowned, reaching out to squeeze her friend's hand. "Lily," she said firmly, "that boy is head over heels in love with you. I'm pretty sure that he hasn't so much as looked at another girl the entire time he's been at Hogwarts. You are bloody gorgeous, and if you could see the way Potter gawks at you, you would know that he thinks that too." "I know," Lily said quietly. "I know it's silly. I like the way I look. I do. I've got no reason to feel this way. She swallowed, glancing up at the mirror across the room. "I'm not thin. Petunia always said..." "Oh, fuck Petunia!" Mary scowled. She'd heard quite enough about the things Lily's sister had said to her. Snide remarks about dieting every Christmas, loud comments about weight, sarcastic jibes about how well-fed they must be at Hogwarts. "That bitch doesn't know what she's talking about. She's just jealous of you, Lily. Always has been." Lily sniffed, wiping at her eyes. After a moment, she took a shaky breath. "You know, when we were younger, that first year or two, I think part of me thought that he was joking or something. Like it was all just some big prank. Lily. And what if he's disappointed, Mary?" The redhead turned to face her, eyes a bit misty. "What if he sees me and I'm just not what he wanted?" Mary stared back at her, unwavering. "Lily Evans," she said slowly, You don't need to do anything you are not comfortable with, all right? You don't owe him anything, and if Potter ever tries to act like you do, I'll hex his bollocks off. But if this is something you want, and it's something he wants, don't let whatever bullshit your sister put in your head get in the way of that. Either James thinks you're the most beautiful person that has ever walked the earth, and he treats you accordingly, or he doesn't, and you dump him, and we set his broom on fire for being the world's biggest idiot. Okay? Mary laughed weakly. Lily laughed weakly. Mary waited for her to look up. When she did, she was smiling. Okay, she said quietly. Thank you, Mary. Oh, come here. Let me get one last hug before those pure virginal arms. Shut up, MacDonald. Lily, 7:03 p.m. There were candles everywhere. Why were there so many candles? Where had he found this many candles? When had he set them all up? Lily? James squeezed her hand, peering down at her. His eyes were wide, anxious, scanning her face. It was an expression she was getting used to. For so long she'd thought that James Potter was just another cocky, arrogant arsehole, a spoilt rich kid who got whatever he wanted, the kind of bloke who was handsome and knew he was handsome, strutting about with his chest puffed out like he owned the world. When she'd heard that he'd been made prefect at the beginning of 6th year, she'd been so frustrated that she'd called Mary and ranted for an hour on the phone until Petunia shouted at her to get off so that she could talk to Vernon. And then the school year had started, and they'd began patrolling together, and he'd been so different, content to follow her lead, saying things like, "It's brilliant the way you've figured out that charm. Would have taken me twice as long," without a trace of humour. Completely genuine. He'd still been arrogant and irritating and prone to showing off, but he'd actually listened, properly listened, when she got cross with him, instead of rolling his eyes or telling her that she was being too uptight. Lily supposed that, in all their time at Hogwarts, she'd never really understood how hard James tried. She'd just assumed that it was all came naturally to him, the confidence, the talent, the unwavering optimism. But the more she spent time with him, the more she noticed the earnestness and the thoughtfulness, the way that he always put his friends above himself. One day she'd watched him spend 15 minutes soothing a crying first year who they'd just found lost outside the boundaries after curfew. And the only thought her brain had been able to supply was, "Oh." That was when she knew she was in trouble. Now she smirked up at her boyfriend, raising an eyebrow. "Potter, exactly how many candles did you put in here?" 62. Lily shook her head, laughing, and he frowned. "Is it too much? I can banish them. I just wanted to—" She interrupted him with a kiss, going up on her tiptoes to reach. "It's lovely." "Oh," he smiled, relieved. "Right. Okay, good." For a moment they only stared at each other. Then he lifted a hand, cradling the side of her face, brushing a thumb across her cheek. We don't have to do anything, if you don't want to. I mean, not that I don't want to, I do, I don't want to do anything unless I want to," she said. He swallowed. "Right." He was staring down at her in a way that made her shiver, made her want to push him onto the tile and climb on top of him and take him apart. Why had she ever felt nervous? It was impossible to feel anything but beautiful with James Potter looking at her like that. "Come on." She stepped around him, smirking over her shoulder. "Water's still warm."
7:37 p.m. Wow. James lay beside her, panting. They were reclining on a fluffy pile of towels, which for some reason smelled strongly of roses. Lily released a breathless laugh, staring up at the ceiling. That was... James shook his head, dazed. That was really... He propped himself up on his elbow, scrambling for his glasses on the floor. Once he'd shoved them up his nose, he looked down at her, eyes still slightly glazed. Was that good for you? Lily smiled, reaching out a hand to trace across his bicep. Yeah, she assured him. It was good. But did you... Did I... He blushed, looking away. Oh, After a moment, she realised what he was asking. Oh! Now she was blushing too. Lily hesitated, considering for a moment whether to lie. But no. James would want to know the truth. She shook her head. No. His face fell, and she hurried to continue. But that's all right. It was still good. Most women don't, so that's... They don't? James gaped, looking so flabbergasted that Lily couldn't help but laugh. No, you big brat. It's actually very uncommon. This is what happens when you get all your information from a Quidditch locker room. She rolled her eyes, smiling. But what's even the point, then? Careful, Potter, Lily said dryly. You'll hurt my feelings. His jaw snapped shut. No, I didn't mean it like that. Obviously you're amazing. That was so bloody incredible. Probably the best thing that ever happened to me. But he glanced down at her hand on his arm, frowning. I want it to feel as good for you as it does for me. She smiled up at him fondly. It's all right, James, really. Their eyes met after a moment. Something in his gaze changed, like a fire stoked to life. It was the sort of burning determination that he usually reserved only for the Quidditch pitch, a look that made her stomach flip every time she watched him mount his broom. Having it focused on her made her feel dizzy, overheated. He leaned down, kissing her, still propping himself up on his elbow. After a moment he paused, murmuring against her lips. Will you show me? Show you? She gasped, trailing off. His mouth had moved down her neck, and his hand was itching up her thigh, making it very difficult to concentrate. How to make it good? For you. His voice was low, breath hot against the shell of her ear. Lily shivered. Lily? He pulled back slightly when she didn't respond. Lily realised she was panting, face flushed, like she'd just run up 2 flights of stairs. Her boyfriend's hair was a mess, sticking up everywhere. She wanted to wrap her fingers in it. Okay, she breathed, feeling as if she were melting. I'll show you. And she did. Regulus. 10:49 p.m. Valentine's Day wasn't horrible as far as holidays went. The frilly decorations that the house elves had put up everywhere were annoying, but at least the couples all fucked off to be by themselves, and nobody expected to celebrate as long as you weren't stupid enough to tangle yourself up in a relationship. The downside, of course, was that Regulus had been kicked out of his own bloody dorm room. Raoul had finally managed to win over the blonde 5th year he'd been chasing since the beginning of term, and had practically begged on his hands and knees for the other boys to vacate the dormitory. Regulus had agreed, mostly because he knew he wouldn't get any sleep anyway. And once he'd given the all clear, of course the other boys fell in line. None of the Slytherins ever dared to disagree with him now. Regulus ran his fingers absent-mindedly over his forearm. He probably should have enjoyed it. The difference. the way his peers suddenly stared up at him with a new respect, both frightened and awed. And sometimes he did. Sometimes it made him feel powerful, like there was finally some peace in his life that he could control. Sometimes he wondered if he would get addicted to it, the way he only had to say one word and suddenly everyone would be scrambling to obey. But other times it just made him feel sick. On the couch across from his armchair, Barty was snoring, head propped up in a weird angle against one of the throw pillows. Regulus sighed, standing, and moved over to a quiet reading nook on the opposite side of the room. He wished there were windows, sometimes, in the slithering common room, that they weren't in a dungeon, so he could just look out and see the sky. But then again, maybe it was for the best. It was impossible to look up at night without seeing him there, a reminder, the brightest bloody star in the sky. Regulus leaned his head back against the stone wall, waiting for the old, familiar loneliness to creep back in. It never left any more. Not really. Just stretched, like a cat, uncurling itself and purring through the marrow of his bones. He sat with it, stroking its head. "Run along, little brother." They were the last words Sirius had spoken to him. Regulus hated himself for clinging to it, for replaying them over and over again. It was pathetic. It made him miserable. Yet he couldn't stop himself from wondering, obsessively, every time they spoke, if this was finally it. If this time it would be the last. "Run along, little brother." It wasn't fair of him to say that. Not fair to wield the word brother like a knife, something sharp and painful, as if he weren't the one who had walked away first, as if he hadn't replaced Regulus the moment he'd stepped onto the Hogwarts Express and found someone better. Sometimes when he saw them together, James Potter and Sirius Black, laughing in the great hall, arms around each other's shoulders, the anger took him by the throat, so powerful that it left him breathless. We were supposed to leave together. He sighed, scrubbing a hand across his face. He knew better than to think like that, though he'd thought he'd abandoned that small, childish voice long ago. They were never both getting out. Regulus had known that, in one way or another, since he was 14. It was just the lack of sleep. He was so tired now, all the time. He'd thought about trying to get his hands on some dreamless sleep potions, but the ones available in the castle were kept under lock and key in Madame Pomfrey's office, and he couldn't exactly explain why he needed it. At least, not without telling her about the nightmares. They'd started after Christmas. It was the same thing every time. The explosions, the dust, the screaming, the colourful flashes of light, curses whipping back and forth in the haze of debris. Regulus stumbled back over crumbling brick, and then there she was. The woman stared up at him, wide brown eyes gasping. She was young, perhaps only a few years older than him, likely fresh out of Hogwarts. She'd probably come to Diagon Alley to do some shopping, maybe meet a few friends, go grab a butterbeer at the Leaky Cauldron. Maybe she'd wanted to stop by the bookstore, or duck into Florin Fortescue's for some ice cream. Maybe mint chip was her favourite flavour. She had smooth, clear skin with a purple scarf and a black woolen coat. She had dark hair that was covered in dust, and the longest eyelashes Regulus had ever seen. She had soft white gloves. She had curls. She had a metal bar punched through the middle of her chest, pinning her to the ground. In the dream, Regulus stared at her. She stared back. She was trying to breathe, but he could see the position of the bar in her chest. It had punctured her lung, gone clean through, and there was already blood pooling in her open, gasping mouth. It was around that point he usually woke up. Regulus reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against some smooth porcelain. He pulled out the little figure, turning it slowly in his hand. An anxious habit. "There are casualties in every battle, Regulus." His father's voice, years ago, spoken over a chessboard. You have to be ready to give some pieces up, if you truly want to protect the ones that matter. Regulus sat there for a long time, holding the pawn in his fist. He wasn't sure how late it was, how many hours had passed. Wasn't sure if it was still night, or if the clock had ticked away into early morning. The sun could be rising outside, but he wouldn't know. He was too far under the ground.
If I could save time in a bottle, the first thing that I'd like to do is to save every day till eternity passes away, just to spend them with you. If I could make days last forever, if words could make wishes come true, I'd save every day like a treasure, and then again I would spend them